Hi everyone, thank you for joining. Today is the second in our series of service design webinars. Today we'll be talking about form design best practices. So I'm Jodie Stanley, I'm a service designer at Hyphenate. I've worked in public sector for quite a few years. Most recently, I worked at Citizens Advice as a user researcher, and I've also worked in other charities as a service designer. Joining me today, we've got Angela.
Hi everyone, I'm Angela Murray. I'm Head of Strategy and Impact at Hyphenate. So I do a couple of things really. One is I work with Kirsten and Jodie and Johnny and the service design team, helping people look at their funding processes and the way that they have their user journey. And then I work with Hyphenate on kind of our business and our pipeline. And before that, I worked for a few different funders. So I worked for Comic Relief and the National Lottery Community Funds, to name a couple. So I've got lots of experience of looking at forms and trying to work out how to make your forms work well.
Thanks, Angela. We've also got Kirsten here.
Hi there, I'm Kirsten Wolf, and I am a service designer at Hyphenate. I've also got lots of experience of thinking about forms, particularly in the context of funding, because I worked for the National Lottery Community Fund for 15 years before I joined Hyphenate. Spent a lot of that time developing funding programs and forms and designing our funding products and Salesforce system.
Thank you, Kirsten. And finally, we've got Johnny here who's joined us.
Hi everyone, I'm Johnny. I'm a digital marketing and UX consultant here at Hyphenate. So I joined Hyphenate last year after 6 years in the non-profit sector. I worked at CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education, and CBM, Christian Blind Mission. And my role at Hyphenate covers all things digital, so everything from email marketing all the way over to website and form design.
Okay, thanks everyone. So the aim of today is to explore best practice in form design. And we know that many organisations are now moving towards relational grant making, and forms might not always be the best option for you. But for those times where we do need forms, we hope this webinar will help you to create great forms that support your organisation and those who you fund in the best way. During the session, please feel free to post any questions or comments that you have throughout, and we'll spend some time answering these at the end. To do this, please use the orange speech bubble on the sign up page to post your questions. So we use forms in our daily lives in so many different contexts. For example, applying for a passport, you might be applying for a loan or mortgage, adding your details onto your online dating profile, or filling in payment details when you're shopping online. And we probably all got experience of good forms and bad forms. Some are easier to complete than others. And the same goes for funding. So funders use forms to ask for information from grant applicants about their funding proposals. They might also use forms to gather bank details and any other essential information. They could also use forms for monitoring or impact data, and also to get some feedback on their services. And it's important for funders to think about the audience for their forms. So who will be completing them? What experience will they have of filling in forms online, and more generally of engaging with the funding process? And how can we make this process easier for them? So first impressions are 94% design related. And whilst this is important in the commercial sector, it's also something we should care about in the funding and non-profit sector. For example, there's a difference between paper-based and digital because digital forms have different functionality and people tend to read differently on paper compared to on the web. So spending time on design helps with improved accessibility for those less digitally savvy users and those who might have disabilities. It can remove barriers for them in applying for funding, help reduce errors and processing time, and reduce stress and confusion for users, which can lead to an overall improved user experience. Good quality forms can improve your service and level up the experience of applying for funding, so that it's not only the more privileged, more experienced organisations that will benefit from your funding. It can open up the playing field to a wider range of groups and help us to ensure that grant making is less unintentionally discriminating. So today we're going to talk you through our 8 top tips for designing forms. I'm going to hand over to Kirsten, who's going to take you through our first few tips.
Hello, everybody. So tip number 1 is to know why you're asking each question. It sounds simple, but you could lose users if there are questions in the form that they consider inappropriate or irrelevant. So this could lead to them entering made up or inaccurate data or even dropping out of the process. So we need to consider the implications of data retention as well, in line with GDPR, if data is collected but we don't use it. So only ask for what's necessary to make a decision. Check again with colleagues or teams who say they need that information. I think we probably all know that the information funders collect can build up over time, and some questions that perhaps a couple of years ago seemed important might now be irrelevant, but they could still be on the form. Think about whether you should retain those questions or remove them. Don't collect information that you don't need, or you don't need at a particular application stage. For example, you might have a multi-stage application process, or you might ask for some kind of initial proposal first. Don't ask for financial information or bank account information from users if you don't need it for their initial application. I mean, there might be some exceptions to this. We sometimes find if you've got a smaller, high volume funding program, collecting everything up front can then save time later on and means you can do some due diligence. But if you don't need the information at a particular stage, don't ask for it. Also, try and be clear about what you're going to do with the information and how you'll keep it safe. And also think about how easy it is to manage and analyse that data, because the more you collect, the more you're going to have to spend time reading it, analysing it, reviewing it. A really important thing to think about is to be able to explain why to the person completing the form, why each question is asked. In testing forms with users, we've seen plenty of examples where users are trying to second guess what a funder's looking for in a question, which isn't ideal. You want it to be quite transparent to them. Or sometimes people might be reluctant to provide certain details, particularly personal details, because it's not clear why the funder is asking for them. So we've got an example on this slide. You can see there's an example of collecting some personal data, and there's explanations underneath. So where we're asking for first name, we're explaining why it can't be a nickname. And we're asking for date of birth, and we're explaining why that information is needed, because otherwise people might leave it blank or decide not to complete the form. Another thing you can do is to use conditional questions. This helps to avoid asking unnecessary questions to users that don't need to answer them. If you need certain pieces of information from only certain types of organisations, think about ways of not having to ask all applicants for it. For example, if you ask for information about annual accounts in an application and you're expecting both new and established organisations to apply, consider using a conditional question like in this example here, so that new organisations don't have to give information about accounts they don't have. So you can see in the example we've got on this slide, if you're a new organisation and you tick yes, you only have to provide a projection, a forecast for the next 12 months. However, if you're an existing organisation and you have got annual accounts, then you're required to put some information about your income and expenditure and your account year-end date. Okay, moving on to tip 2. Tip 2 is we want to help people fill out forms correctly the first time. And we've got a quote here, 80% of government costs are spent on services and up to 60% of those costs are spent on service failure. Now, by service failure, we mean where those services don't work correctly the first time and we have to go back and we have to ask for more information, or customers can't get through the process the first time. Incomplete or incorrect submissions will result in more work because you have to go back to the applicant for more information. So here are some tips that are going to help you to avoid that kind of failure. Think about including some information before you start a form. We've got an example here from government website, and this is about applying for a change of address to a driving licence. You can see it lists the things you're required to have first, one of them being not be banned from driving, which is handy. We've also got another example on the next slide, which is more specific to funding, and that might be to provide users with a little bit of information about what they're going to need to complete that form, whether that's any documents, things like copies of accounts, copies of bank statements, information they're going to need before they can actually fill that form out, because it's going to be pretty frustrating for them if they get halfway through the form, find they haven't got that information, they have to stop, they have to go away and find it. It makes it more difficult for them to complete. You can also use an eligibility check or an upfront check before applicants actually get to an application form to help them to fill it in without wasting time, because if they go through the application eligibility check first, they'll know in advance if they actually can't progress any further. So we've got an example here. the customers tick that they're not a tenant, therefore they get a message saying that they actually can't apply on this occasion. This can be used to help filter out groups or projects that you can't fund before they even get to the main application form. You can also consider using technology to pre-populate fields from the data we've already got from users. And this helps them to see what we've already got on them, and we've probably already checked it to make sure it's correct. But they can also have the option to update that information if they need to. So that's saving them time from filling information in. It's saving them from filling in information that they sometimes get incorrect. For example, we often find that smaller grassroots organisations applying for funding might struggle to actually know what the legal name of their organisation is or what they're legally constituted as. So if we've already checked that and got that information, if we can pre-populate it, then it's already waiting there for them. Probably the biggest tip here is to find out what the most common errors, omissions and mistakes are when users apply to you for funding. So if you can identify where you're most frequently having to go back to those users, you can then start to do something about it. If possible, ask them directly why they find those areas challenging and use the information that they give you to think about ways to improve those questions so people don't keep tripping up on the same thing. For example, in one form I was involved in developing at the National Lottery Community Fund, there was a section asking users about diversity of their beneficiaries for equalities monitoring purposes, things like disabilities, ethnic background, age, etc. We found that people were often checking every box on that, which didn't seem right. And when we asked, it turned out that users were checking every box because they thought that would improve their chance of getting funding because they were reaching all those different groups. But that wasn't actually the purpose of the question. So we added some help text to the question explaining why we were asking for it and telling them that it didn't form part of the assessment process. They weren't going to be assessed on it. Tip 3, set expectations at the beginning. So give users an idea of what to expect as they're working their way through the form. And there's a few things you can do here. The first thing is to explain the process to them at the beginning. And you can have some guidance. This could be on a website, for example, explaining where they've got to in the process. So they're doing an initial eligibility check and then thinking about what comes next. So then they'll then fill in a full application form and then we will review their application and let them know if we're going to award funding. You can also have a summary of questions at the beginning of a form so that you can see what sections people need to fill in. People don't have to click all the way through the form to find out what they need to think about. It can be quite intimidating if there are lots of pages to click through with no indication of what to expect on each of them. But by doing it this way, you're giving them a little bit of information up front. They're feeling prepared. And then we've also got the option of adding in navigation, which we can use to show users which section they've got to and what's coming up next. So you can have this along the top of a screen on a form, and it will show you where you've got to and what's still to come. Tip 4, one thing per page. And by one thing, we mean one question or one theme or area that's related. So here on the next slide, we've got an example of where we've got multiple things on one page. And then an example where there's only the one. You can see from the example we've given that we're picking out a small piece of information from that first very long form. And in the second example, it's the same sort of information that's requested, but it's much, much simpler and easier to complete. Having one thing per page helps people to understand what you're asking them to do. It improves accessibility by reducing the cognitive load of the page so people can focus on just one question or one theme. And that's better for everyone, but especially people with cognitive impairments or learning disabilities who might struggle and be overwhelmed by a whole page full of questions. It also helps users to recover from errors because they can then clearly see if they go through the form, they don't fill in something correctly, they can see where the error message is. It's much clearer. Whereas if you've got a form with lots of questions on, if you've made multiple errors on that page, you're having to then go back through lots of little red things and trying to work out where those errors are. It's easier to save a user's answers automatically as they go if you've only got one question per page, because people are less likely to stop completing something partway through the page if there's too much of it on there. You can capture analytics more easily about each question, which helps you to learn about how things are being filled in, how people are using those web pages. And you can also, it's better for handling conditional questions, which we touched on earlier when we talked about that question about the accounts and how you've got a couple of options there, depending on whether the organisation was new or not. It's much better for handling conditional questions that depend where the next question depends on the answer to the first one, if you've only got one thing per page. On the next slide, you can see that there's an example here of using a form on a mobile device. So that's something we need to bear in mind as well. If you've got multiple questions and pieces of information on one page, if users are trying to fill it in on a mobile, it's going to be really difficult. So here you can see sort of a slightly exaggerated, very long phone with a long form on it, and people are going to have to scroll down, and it's going to be quite tricky. Whereas if you've only got that one thing on a page, I'm sure we've all got experience of this ourselves, it's much easier to complete. There are some exceptions or times when it makes sense to have more than one thing on a page. This is usually when the questions are very closely related or reference one another. An example might be if you've got some questions about a project or activity that you're asking, that a customer's asking for funding for. Sometimes we want to split those questions up for simplicity, but if they're all on different pages, the applicant might not know what's coming next, so they might answer part of the subsequent questions on that first page. It's easier for them to be able to see them together. So those are our tips about one thing per page. For our next tips, I'm going to hand over to Ange.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So our next tip is order your questions to make it easier for users. So this is all about how your form flows. And a lot of this is common sense, but we thought it was worth covering some of our kind of top tips in this section. And this is particularly important for helping your forms to be accessible. So lots of people filling in forms might be paid to do that, might be part of their job. But if you're trying to reach a lot of, let's say, community groups, there might be people filling in your forms that are just volunteers. It's the end of a long day, they're trying to fill it in. If they encounter quite a difficult flow to the form, that can put them off. They might not even fill in the form at all. So thinking about these can really help your completion rates on your forms. So our first tip here is have your core information before your supplementary information. So unless your form is super short, which is great, if it's short, that's brilliant. But if you've got a reasonable amount of information, there's likely to be some information that we would consider core. So everybody has to complete this. And then there might be some information that's a bit more optional. So it's not mandatory questions. It's maybe not quite so core to, let's say it's an application to the project. It might be around due diligence. It really helps to have the core information first. So the things that people are maybe more confident in and they're expecting, and then those optional things later in the form. Related to that is our second one here, easy before difficult. So we've mentioned that people filling in the form might be coming to it late at night. They might not have a lot of time to do it. They're going to feel more confident in your form if they can make some good progress early on. So having easy questions are things like your contact details, your organization details. Why do you want this funding? If it's an application or if it's a report form, what have you done in this last period? Things that people are going to have to mind first can just help them get confident in the form. If you've got, like Kirsten was showing navigation, if you've got a percentage calculator or something that's tracking your progress, people will feel like, yeah, I'm making some good progress with this form. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to make it to the end. Related questions go together as our next tip in this section. So often in a form, we're asking similar questions or questions that might be related to each other. So let's say, for example, I'm filling in a form and I'm being asked questions about a budget. I might have to open a spreadsheet of costs. I might open accounts. I'm looking at that kind of information. So I'm really thinking about finance. If I then later in the form, quite a bit later, get asked another question about finance, I might have to reopen that stuff that I was previously looking at, thinking that I'd finished it. So it really helps to have all of those things together, cover off a topic that people might have to research and think about. And then finally, we've got be consistent. So this one's very much about the user experience in a form. So a couple of examples to hopefully bring this to life a little bit. So let's say, for example, you're asking for contact details a few times in your form. So maybe you're asking for contact details about project lead and a finance person and contact details for an organization. Each time you ask for those, if you have the fields in the same order, so let's say first name, surname, email address, phone, postal address, whatever it is, each time they're in the same order, people get used to that and they expect it, and it makes it just easier and quicker for them to complete the form. If you're using questions where, let's say you've got a yes, no answer or yes, no, maybe, always having the yes, no in the same order is really helpful. We don't want to catch people out by flipping it to no, yes, unless there's a particular reason that we're trying to get them to think about something differently, but generally having them in the same order just helps people complete the form. Moving on to our next tip, which is, I don't know if I'm allowed to have favourite ones, but this is one of my favourites. Keep questions simple and avoid jargon. So keeping things simple is something you'll hear us say quite a bit today. And we've got a little stat here, which is that users only read about 20 to 28% of a web page. So when I'm reading something on a screen or on my phone, I'm going to read it differently to how I'm reading a book. So if you think back to those days pre-COVID, when maybe you sat on a train a lot or you were traveling a lot, you often see people with their phone and they're like scrolling through, and you can tell they're not reading everything. They're just scrolling. They may be looking for a tweet that jumps out at them. They're skimming the words. That's typically how people read on a mobile device, particularly if we give people a big chunk of text. So when you're designing your form, if you give them a big paragraph of text, it's likely they're going to skim through that, especially if we use long words. So the longer and more complex it is, the more people are likely to skim. And it's also a fact that if people are rushed, they're also more likely to skim. So we spend at Hyphenate a lot of time thinking about forms. You probably spend a lot of time thinking about the forms that you create. So they're really important to us. The people using our forms are usually trying to get through our forms as quickly as possible. So they just want to get through it. They want to get the information in. They want to click submit. So you think about when you filled in forms, I think about like a tax form. I'm just wanting to get through it. So I'm skimming the information on the page. So we can really help people by keeping things as simple as possible. So we've got a question here as an example. You might recognize this type of question if you work in funding. So we're monitoring the performance of your project. Which internal KPIs will you be measuring this against? So we've got a bit of jargon in there, internal KPIs. We probably don't need to use that phrase. So we could reword this question to make it more simple. And wherever we can, that's a really good thing to do. It's true that we can't always do that. So we've got an example on the next slide where we've got some jargon in the question. And there are some genuine use cases where we need to use complex terminology. So maybe in this example, which is one we see quite often actually, indirect beneficiaries, it might be that you've got to report on to the government or an institutional donor, and it's really important that everybody is using that same definition so that you've got data that you can aggregate together. So if that's the case, if you have to use it, our recommendation is to put an explanation just below or above the box so people can see what it is that you're meaning by that particular piece of jargon. We also want to think about the length of our questions. So not sure how easy this is for you to read on the screen. So I'm just going to read it out. This is our long question. So what steps have you taken in the development of this project? And how do you expect the project to benefit the local community? Does the project have any existing funding, approved funding, or are you waiting to hear back about a submitted application? You can include the conversations and meetings that have already occurred and those that are planned in the future. Now, something we end up discussing quite a bit with people we work with here at Hyphenate is, can you have too many questions in a form? And people are quite worried about having a lot of questions. And one of the things that we can do to try and avoid questions is what we've done here, which is collate questions all together. So we're trying to make the form more simple, but by doing that, we end up with a really long question. And actually, when we look at what happens when users respond to that question, they typically don't answer all of the questions. So in that long question, there was a lot of questions in there. They probably won't answer all of them, or if they do, they won't do it in the way that you were hoping that they would. So it is actually better to split them out. You will get better responses. It might lead to more questions on your form, but it makes it a lot easier for the users. And that's what we've done in this example here. Keeping things simple and avoiding jargon is also really important for accessibility. So it's important to remember that not everybody filling in our forms might have English as a first language. There might be people with learning difficulties using our form, and people just might not have a particularly high reading age. I remember when I was working at the Community Fund, someone mentioned that the average reading age in the UK is around 9 years. So that means they've attained the reading age you might expect of a 9-year-old. And we really want with our forms that people, whether they've got English as a first language, they maybe struggle with reading, etc., they still find our forms accessible and easy to use. So it's really worth taking the time to write your questions, pause and think, is there any way that I could make that question more easy to understand and simpler? Moving on to our next top tip. So this one, if there's any of these that are controversial, I think it might be this one, which is show the guidance users need when they need it. So we're really aware, and having worked at a funder, I feel like I've contributed to this, that there can be quite an industry around guidance PDFs. Like, we love to create lots of guidance, and with the right intention, we want it to be helpful. There's lots of information, let's say, about a program, about how to apply, about what all the different questions mean. But in reality, people find those guidance PDFs quite difficult to use. So we were working with one funder that actually did some research into their guidance documents, and only around 25% of people were actually looking at the guidance, and not sure how many of those are reading all of it. So guidance documents could be missed, or people just might choose not to look at them. They also make it less accessible for your form. So if you imagine, especially if you're using on a mobile device, you've got the form, say, open in one tab. In the second tab, you've got your guidance document, or you've had to find a printer and print out the guidance document, and you've got to keep referring between the two documents. That just makes it harder as a user experience, and it can be, it can exclude people. So people who maybe find it more difficult, they've got maybe some motor problems and it's difficult to move the mouse, having to keep flipping between the tabs is just adding to their kind of stress using your form. So we recommend having the guidance next to the questions so people are accessing it at the point that they need to access it. And we've got an example here on the screen of how to do that. We also just wanted to mention in guidance, actually Kirsten referred to it earlier in another point, is that it's also important to add guidance if there's any questions that you think might put people off, they might feel sensitive about. So we had the date of birth example earlier. Could be around, let's say you're funding people who've got themselves into debt, for example. You need to ask particular questions that might seem sensitive about their finances. Just having a line next to the question of guidance just to explain why you need that can really help people. So I'm going to hand over to Jodie now for our 8th and final tip.
Thanks, Ange. So last and definitely not least, our last tip is test forms with real users. So the best way to find out whether a form works well or not is to test with real users. Testing with just 5 users can identify 5% of issues of a form. And even if you don't have a lot of time to do this, it's definitely worth doing. There's lots of ways that you can do this. So you can do this with a prototype of the form rather than a fully functional one to get feedback early before you invest more time and money in finalising it. You can also ask for feedback directly from your users, or even better, get their permission to observe them completing the form so that you can see for yourself where they might hesitate or get stuck completing the form. It's good to consider getting feedback from people who don't currently apply for your funding, especially if it's the type of group you'd like to attract, so then you can maybe understand why they're not already applying for funding. It's also a good idea to do some show and tells with stakeholders to share what you've learned from your research, and this can really help them to understand why you might need to make some changes to the form, especially if they're not fully on board with them already. And if you can, try to involve your stakeholders from your organisation in user research activities. So sometimes at -8, I get my colleagues to do some note taking when I'm doing some observations. That can really help them to understand from the user's perspective why that form's not necessarily working as well for them as it should. And they can get to see users' reactions for themselves. Or you can even just ask them to come along and observe whilst you're doing testing. So that's all of our top tips for today. So to do a quick recap, our tips were: know why you're asking each question. So only ask things that you really need to ask. Help people to fill in forms correctly for the first time. So where you need guidance, make sure you have some guidance there and make sure it makes sense to your users. Set expectations at the beginning and throughout. Let your users know what's expected of them and how much left they have to complete of the form where possible. Stick to one thing per page. That's one thing, not necessarily questions. That's one theme or topic. Order your questions to make it easier for users. And Andrew's favourite, keep questions simple and avoid jargon where possible. So if you really need to use jargon, you might need a bit of help text to explain what that jargon means. Show the guidance users need when they need it. So if you can avoid having those big guidance documents, keep your guidance in the form where it's relevant. And finally, test forms with real users so that you can see how it's really working for them. And that's the end of our presentation today. So hopefully you've had some time to post some questions in our live chat or comments. And if you haven't, then please do so now. and I'll wait for some questions to pop up so we can get answering them for you. Right, so our first question is, how long is too long for a form? And I think this is probably a little bit of a tricky question to answer, but I'm going to give it to you, Ange.
Thank you. Well, I definitely wouldn't say there's a rule. Like, we wouldn't say this is, when it gets to this number of pages or this number of questions, it's too long. I think the key thing to think about is proportionality. So what is the form used for? And how can you ask the least number of questions to get the information you need for that particular thing? So we would typically expect, if it's a grant application, let's say for a small amount of money, that the form should be relatively short comparative to, let's say you're asking, people are applying for like £500,000, then there'll be like a genuine reason to have the form longer. But I think our tip that Kirsten shared about thinking about why you ask the questions is really important. So rather than think about how long the form is, I guess it's how short can you make it? And thinking about where is the information already in the public domain, so you don't have to ask that question. Are they attaching their accounts, for example, so they don't need to also type that into the form? So just thinking about where you can make it as streamlined as possible. Don't know if I dodged that question there, Jodie, without an exact.
Yeah, that was great. I was just going to add to it as well. And I think, so once you've kind of launched a new form, it's a good idea to see if you can get some feedback from people who are completing it. And I think if it's too long, your users will probably tell you as well. So listen to the people completing the form as well. So in your experience, how long would an average review and update of application forms take? Kirsten, do you want to give that one a go?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose it's a bit of a process, isn't it? So you probably want to spend a little bit of time actually looking through your form to start with, and that might take thinking about whether you still need that information, if there's anything that's duplicated, any simple things you can do before you do any testing with users or you do any changes to it. So, I mean, that takes as long as it needs to take, really. But that's something you can certainly do internally within your organisation. You can start thinking about that, have a couple of meetings with some colleagues. Then after that, you're probably going to want to sort of start doing a bit of a prototype of what your new form could look like. Again, not quite sure how long that might take, but could take, from a few hours of work just to sort of pull something together. It doesn't have to be the final completed thing. We talked about prototyping. You can just have an example that's not necessarily functional, but you can test with users. And then we can talk about user testing, which we always recommend you try and do a little bit of. Maybe that takes an hour or so to watch a user going through a form to do a little bit of observation. We'll be talking more about that in our next webinar, so there's a little bit of a trail for you. So really, I mean, you could get stuff done in a couple of weeks, really, to just, if you spread it out a little bit, just have a little bit of a think about it. But don't forget, once you, as Jodie said, once you launch a form, that's not the end. You can still continue to update it over time, partly because your needs might change, but also you want to get that feedback from your users. So it's not really a static process. It's something that can sort of be iterative and continue.
Yeah. The one thing I would just maybe add to that, I'm sorry, Johnny, I know you just put the next question up, would be that I think sometimes we can have a tendency to think about application forms as like the grant making process, but it's like one part of the process. So depending on how much time you do have, it's often good to take that chance where if you're going to review your application form, just to think about the ongoing process and how that relates to it. So things you collect in the application form might be used later in reporting, or they might be used with the data team. And if you've got time, it's just worth pulling in those kind of other people who might be working in it, just to kind of help with that design, and rather than just looking at it in isolation from the other elements.
Okay, so next one. Any tips for getting staff on board with inputting to form review when staff are very busy? Thinking promoting time savings down the line in terms of support required, streamline review process. Any tips again? So I'm having to read that through to myself again. I'll have a quick stab at that, and I'm sure you guys all want to jump in. I would say get people involved from the beginning in early conversations, so that they're aware of what's going on. And what I always find really useful is if you have got feedback from your users, tell your colleagues about that, because that's the voice of the users kind of speaks louder than your voice often. So let them know why it needs changing, why your users are struggling, and what benefits that you think it could bring to your organisation. Any thoughts from anyone else?
Offer snacks, bribe.
Yeah, that normally works as well. That's not so easy when you're working from home, though.
Yeah,
it's a tricky one, isn't it? But quite often, especially if it's anything that's directly to do with your job or relates to you, or it's data you're collecting that you need, if you start flagging that up to people, they will want to have a say, even if they are busy. I think.
Yeah, we tend to find that people are like, if they're working in that kind of job, they really want the service that you offer to be good. Like they want applicants to have a good experience. They don't want to be dealing with complaints. And I guess using that as the kind of hook and key to getting people involved could help.
How do you handle different currencies in forms? This is something that we have had to tackle at Hyphenate. Johnny, I think you've worked on some currency stuff in forms. Do you want to give this a go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a good one. It goes back to using conditional logic to display only the relevant questions. So, for example, at the start of the form, we could have a page that has which currency do you want to apply in, and then further down the form or later on in the process, the only questions that they'll be asked is if they select US dollars. Further down the line, they'll only be asked, could you complete your budget section in US dollars, rather than some manual thing that goes on in the background. Does that make sense? Anyone else?
That made sense to me, I think.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Johnny. Johnny, I think this is another question for you. What tools would you recommend for building forms?
Okay, so at the moment, we very much recommend Form Assembly, which is our go-to form design tool. Not only is it really flexible in what it offers, it also plugs in really well with the CRM system. Obviously, we are Salesforce consultancy, and the link between Form Assembly and Salesforce is pretty seamless, and it means that our consultants can get all the data from the form into the correct area in Salesforce. I don't know if Angie wants to add anything to that one.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say, like, we see people use lots of different form building tools, and particularly if your form is really simple, like, you don't need to overthink it. If Google Forms is going to work for you, or SurveyMonkey or something you've used is going to work, then that's fine. I think Form Assembly is really good if your form's more complex and you do want to sync it into Salesforce. Those other tools can sync as well, but yeah, I think it depends on the complexity of the form that you've got.
Cool.
Don't forget, if you want to ask any questions, you can use the little orange. Is it like a text sign in the corner of the web page?
Down there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
down there.
Down there.
Thanks, Kirsten. Okay, the next question is, how do you test forms during COVID times? I can give this one a stab because that's something I've been doing recently. And it's a good question because a few years ago, I would have tested face-to-face and kind of sat down next to a user, got a computer in front of them and watched them go through a form. But you can use tools like Teams, which is something we do. So we'll get our users to share their screen and actually go on the form. And it's a good idea to record as well, so you can go back and get anything that you've missed. And just kind of let them go through the form, and they can do that from home in the same way that they would have done that in person before. So yeah, you can still test. Don't let COVID stop you.
Yeah, you can use Zoom as well, because I know lots of people have Zoom on their computers and probably don't use Teams as much. Although I have noticed one of the downsides with that is you can't record. So it involves a lot of note taking on the part of the observer, but it's still completely doable.
Yeah, I definitely recommend, if you're not able to record, get someone to take notes with you so that you can focus on the testing. Right, another question. So we use Form Assembly. Is there any way of making the forms look more appealing? Our forms are a bit boring. So Johnny makes all of our forms look fab. So do you want to answer this, Johnny?
Yeah, sure. So out of the box, Form Assembly is quite standard, but it does allow allow custom code, so we can add any HTML or CSS to jazz it up as much as we want, really. It is really flexible. You just have to know what you're doing. It's not something like a drag and drop. Drag and drop is quite standard, boxy feel, but yeah, there is the capability to make things look super jazzy.
And that also includes branding as well. So you can get your branding on there. Okay, the next question we've got, is it okay to ask for date of birth with data protection in mind? And you're a data protection person here, I think. Do you want to answer that one?
I don't know if I want that title, but yeah, so it's fine to ask for it as long as you've got a genuine reason for asking for it. So I guess we were talking earlier about having a line of text on the form to explain why you're asking for it. So if you can't explain why you're asking for it, you probably shouldn't be collecting it. So you need to have a reason to collect it. And it's good to think about not just date of birth, but all the information that you collect. Do you need it? But then also, how long do you need it for? So, for example, you might be collecting date of birth because you might want to do a fraud check or an identity check on somebody. If they're then unsuccessful and you don't end up progressing with them, you could just delete that, and that would be good practice to do that.
Thanks, Ange. Any more questions, Johnny?
I think there's some.
So can form assembly cope with complex validation and error messaging? Sorry, Johnny, it's for you again.
Let me think. Complex validation, yes, to a certain extent, I think. Ange, anything to add on the complex validation? I'm not entirely sure. I think, how complex are we talking? That's the thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example where we've not been able to do the validation that someone wanted, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. It does all the obvious ones that you would expect in a fairly standard application form or reporting form. Yeah, if anyone's got an example that they've not been able to do, we'd love to have the challenge of figuring out whether it's possible.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of error messaging, I think it's quite standard out of the box error messaging, which just follows like industry standards and best practices. But in terms of flexibility, there's not a huge amount of additional things that you can add. There is some more questions, but I'm just trying to keep up with them. Let me have a look.
Right, so we've got, is there any online guidance to help with improving the look of forms? It's a good question.
Yeah, does this relate back to the question about improving the look of your form assembly forms and any ways of being able to get trained or get guidance on that, I suppose?
Yeah. I'm just thinking, Kirsten, at the community funds, I think the user experience team are taking quite a lot of information from the gov.uk design guide. So there's been quite a lot of research done into what works well with forms and good ways to lay things out and the kind of patterns that people respond well to. So that could be one place to go to have a look.
It depends whether you're talking about sort of cosmetic jazzy stuff or whether you're talking about actually good practice in UX and making sure the user experience is really good. Because gov.uk, they are quite, there's a lot of information you can just find on their website that's really helpful.
Hopefully that answered your question.
That's all the questions that we've had come in so far, I think.
Okay.
Should we leave it another 30 seconds just to see if anyone wants to jump in?
Angela, Kirsten, Johnny, do you have any final comments that you'd like to share before we close for today, or we wait for some more questions?
No, we don't have anything other than our next webinar is how to carry out user research.
Yeah, good point. Good point. So yeah, it's an opportunity for us to plug that. So in October, we'll be having another webinar and we'll be focusing on zooming in our 8th tip, which was user testing, and going into some detail about that. So please do look out for dates for that. And unless there's any more questions, I think that's all from us for today.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add, Jodie, just as we finish is I hope people have found that helpful. I know it's really, or it can be quite difficult when you get like general tips and you're working on like forms that are really important to you and you're trying to work on. So if there's stuff that's come up, you think I'd just really like to get, an opinion on that, or I just want to talk about this specific case, then feel free to, always get in touch with Hyphenate. And then one thing that sprang to mind of Form Assembly questions is that there are some really good videos that Form Assembly provide, like they record their own sessions that give you some insights into using that tool and ways that you can make things look better. So whoever was asking about that might be something worth looking at if you've not seen that already.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you have lovely evenings and see you in our next webinar, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.